The winter of 1834 did not arrive. It attacked. Not the gentle snow of storybooks, but a season that carved itself into bone and timber. Temperatures in the mountain hollows plunged below 20 degrees night after night. Frost stitched itself into clothing seams, crept along cabin logs, and clung to breath until every exhale floated like a ghost that refused to fade. In one lonely hollow, 40 miles from the nearest trading post, a small cabin held a secret, one that would soon tear through an entire valley's understanding of survival. Inside that dim room, a family moved like shadows around a squat stone hearth the father had built a decade earlier, from river rock and mud mortar. It had always been unpredictable, a fire that warmed in fair weather but lied in storms. Night, as the wind shoved against the roof and the creek beyond the ridge froze solid, the fireplace revealed its true nature. The flames coughed, smoke curled, and the first hint of betrayal slithered into the air. What hidden flaw inside this innocent-looking chimney could turn an ordinary winter night into a life-or-death catastrophe? You'll witness exactly how, and how one frontier family fought to survive it, as the story unfolds. Smoke began low and innocent, a gray curling into the rafters. Within minutes, the air changed. It thickened. Astringent soot stung the eyes. A gust from a narrow gap in the eave forced the draft to reverse, and the room filled with choking black. The father yanked timber from the grate and slammed the iron poker in a panic. The mother beat on blankets to fan the flame, praying the smoke would find the throat it was meant to go up. But the chimney, a stack of stones, mortared with cold clay, had a defect no one had seen coming. The flue narrowed where the chimney met the roof, and the angle of the throat sat nearly vertical instead of leaning to the outside draft. That vertical throat, combined with a wind shear slicing the ridge at 35 to 50 psi impra, created the perfect backdraft. The young son, 12, remembered later that the first sign was a sound, a deep, wet rasp, as if the house itself were dying. Then the heat changed. Instead of a broad, comforting warmth, a hot tongue licked the far wall near the mantel. The stone began to bloom, hairline cracks spidering through mortar. Sparks, small at first, winked like angry insects between the logs. The family pushed toward the door, but the cold outside had become a closed mouth. The wind shrieked around the eaves and flung packed snow like sand. They were trapped between two enemies, a fire that wanted to climb into the house and a storm that would not let them go out and breathe. At some point, the creosote, the black tar deposited inside flues from months of smoky, low-temperature burns, met an open ember or a glowing hot plate and flashed. Creosote will ignite near 450 degrees when it has pooled and baked inside a cool flue. In narrow, poorly insulated chimneys, it can do so silently and quickly. The flame found the worst place to grow, inside the throat, where mortar was thin and the stones had been set on frozen ground months earlier. Lime and mud mortar, not properly cured, can crumble under sudden heat stress and intermittent freezing. The mortar failed, and the stones shifted. The noise was more terrifying than the light. A dull, rolling sound, a house shifting its weight, was followed by the thunder of falling stone. A corner of the chimney collapsed inward, and the fire took the path of least resistance into the roof timbers. Green wood rafters, still damp from recent rains, and only superficially dried for slow-burning fires, popped and spit. The blaze hit those beams and found fuel in places the hearth had never seen. Old rope, a hidden stack of winter kindling tucked near the eaves, the family's spare bedding. The cabin's defenses, hearth irons, a bucket of water by the door, 2 hand axes, were suddenly inadequate. They moved like slow animals towards the door. Smoke stung the lungs to such a degree that their eyes shut as if trying to block the pain. The father, memory later recorded, felt his own heart hammer against his ribs with the realized fear that ember and wind could work together to turn a shelter into an oven. He fought with hands that shook to pull a sodden blanket over an ember and to shove coals away from a seam. At the final moment, when the roof began to glow faintly through the cracks, the youngest pushed a window open, and a ribbon of cold drowned the smoke just enough to drag them out. Outside, the world was a white hurricane. They huddled beneath a lee of rock, watching the orange tongue eat their house. The storm ate sound, and the family's voices were small things, swallowed by the wind. When the fire finally consumed what it could, a roof, a wall, the hearth itself, what remained was a skeleton of charred beams and a heap of riverstones black with soot. The chimney lay broken at an odd angle, a column half toppling in the snow. It would be weeks before word of the failure reached the trading post, and months before a builder came down the ridge with tools, lime, and the knowledge to set a flue that would resist both creosote and gale. But in that hour, with breath fogging and hands numb, the family understood a harsh frontier truth. A shelter built by tradition alone could kill you as surely as the weather. What if the chimney failed not from chance, but from a mistake in angle and material, something the valley had been doing wrong for years? 3 days after the collapse, the storm lifted its white curtain and showed the ridge as it truly was, scarred, wind-scoured, and silent. Smoke no longer rose from the hollow where the family's cabin had stood. Only a black stump of stone marked the place where warmth had once been. The father and son had taken shelter in a crude lean-to under the spruce grove. Their breaths still carried soot, their eyes ringed red from smoke poisoning. They did not yet know that help was walking toward them across the snow. The man who crested the ridge that morning was not a trapper, though he carried a rifle. He was not a missionary, though he walked with quiet purpose. His name was Jonas Rook, a traveling carpenter attached loosely to the American Fur Company, one of those half-employed, half-wandering craftsmen hired to repair cabins, reinforce way stations, and build winter shelters for trappers who never stayed in one place long enough to finish a roof correctly. His coat was cinched with hemp rope, his beard was rimed with frost, and tied to his pack were the unmistakable tools of his trade: a broadaxe, a grinding stone, a folding saw, a bundle of lime mortar in waxed cloth. He noticed the smoke scar before he noticed the family. Rook approached the ruin carefully, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the toppled chimney. The stones lay in a semicircle, as if pushed inward from an unseen force. He crouched and ran his glove over the broken mortar. The cold had powdered it into dust. A thin black crust stained the stones, creosote, baked and burst. He spoke aloud, though no one was near enough to hear. Backdraft and heat fracture. That flue never stood a chance. This was not the first collapsed chimney he had seen. In 1831, on the Green River Trail, he had helped rebuild 2 trapping cabins whose chimneys had snapped after sudden temperature shocks. In 1832, a homesteader near Bear Lake lost half his roof to a creosote-fueled flare when his clay chinking cracked into 15 degrees South weather. These were not rare accidents, they were patterns. The same mistakes repeated across valleys and time. When Rook found the family huddled in their makeshift shelter, he introduced himself with few words and a soft nod. He inspected their burns, the soot in their noses, the frostbite forming on their fingertips. Frontier medicine was simple: warmth, rest, and fresh air. He helped them reset the lean-to's supports and built a fire outside, far from the smoldering ruins. The father tried to speak, but coughed instead. A ragged, painful cough that shook his frame. "You breathed a chimney fire," Rook said gently. "Not your fault. These mountains are full of bad flues built in good faith." The young son stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Why did it happen?" "Pa built it strong." Rook knelt beside the boy. "Strong is not the same as right." He pointed to the collapsed stones. "That chimney was set too straight, almost vertical. Winter winds strike from the west and push down. When the throat narrows, smoke has no path. Pressure rises inside until something gives." He tapped a stone flecked with creosote. "And this black tar burns hotter than people expect." The boy swallowed hard. "So, it wasn't a curse? Or a bad spirit?" Frontier families often blamed loss on what they couldn't understand. Rook shook his head. No curse, just bad angles and bad mortar. He stood and walked the perimeter of the ruin, studying the footprints, the scorch marks, the way the wall had collapsed. His eyes were practiced, a craftsman's gaze shaped by small details and rough truths. He found what he needed on the inside lip of the chimney's base, a thin line of damp clay, chinking, that had never fully cured. Moisture trapped inside clay can freeze, expand, create microfractures. When stressed by sudden heat, like a creosote fire, those fractures widen, turning the chimney into a brittle cage. Rook exhaled slowly. This wasn't just backdraft. The whole thing was built on softened joints. He spent hours walking the site, silent and intent, until the father finally asked, "Can it be rebuilt before the next storm?" Rook looked toward the horizon. Clouds were already forming, another weather front assembling its weight. "It can," he said, "but not the way it was. I'll begin tomorrow." The family exchanged uncertain glances. They had no money to pay him, but frontier people were judged more by their needs than their coins, and Rook waved away the worry. "Winter doesn't wait for a wage," he said simply. That night, Rook slept lightly beneath the spruce canopy. He traced diagrams in the frost while explaining to the boy what they would do: widen the throat, angle the flue toward prevailing wind, set proper stone curvature, line the interior with a clay sleeve, insulate with lime mortar cured close to embers. The boy memorized every word, as if knowledge itself could warm them. Before sleep took him, Jonas Rook stared at the collapsed chimney one last time and murmured, "That mistake has lived too long on this frontier. Time to kill it." But could one carpenter, alone on a frozen ridge, rebuild a chimney fast enough to outrun another storm? Jonas Rook began. The next day, the way craftsmen do, not with hurried action, but with a long, deliberate silence. He sat on a stump beside the black ruin, sharpening the edge of his broadaxe with a slow, steady rhythm. The sound was soft, but carried weight, steel whispering against stone, preparing itself to rebuild what the mountain had broken. The boy sat opposite him, wrapped in a blanket, soot still faintly staining the creases of his face. He watched every movement, every measured breath. Something in him had shifted since the collapse. Fear had carved a hollow inside him, and knowledge was about to fill it. Rook finally set the stone down. "Let me show you where your chimney died." He walked to the toppled stack, snow crunching under his boots. The father stepped closer too, though his chest still burned from smoke poisoning. Rook pointed to the scattered stones. "You see that dark glazing?" The boy nodded. "That's creosote, tar from wood smoke. Slow burns, wet logs, green pine, all of it leaves this behind. Inside a chimney, it's just waiting for a spark." He pried a broken stone from the pile and flipped it over. The underside was slick with hardened black crust. "This," he said, tapping the surface, "ignites hotter than any log you'll ever put on a fire. 450 degrees, sometimes less if the air is right. Once it burns, it's like lighting oil inside your walls." The boy swallowed. "But why did it burn last week and not last winter?" Rook turned the stone and pointed to a hairline crack crawling through the mortar. "Failed. Your father used clay from the bank and mixed it with snowmelt. Not his fault. Everyone here does the same. But clay needs weeks to dry before winter. If moisture stays in it, the freeze expands it. The cracks are invisible at first. Then one hot night and..." He snapped his fingers. "The whole flue becomes a lantern wick." The boy's eyes went wide. "And the wind, how did it push the fire back at us?" Rook motioned for them to follow. He walked around the ruins to a point where the collapsed chimney met the roofline. He crouched and traced a line in the snow. "Your chimney throat was too straight," he said. "Look at the stones. No lean, no outward draft. Winter winds come from that ridge. When the draft reverses, the smoke has nowhere to go." The father frowned. "I'd always heard a straight chimney draws the best." Rook let out a slow, tired sigh, the sigh of a man who had seen too many cabins die the same way. "A straight chimney is a lazy man's chimney." He looked the man square in the eyes. "You want a chimney to fight the wind, to lean into it, to take the cold like a man takes a punch. sideways. He drew another line in the snow, angling it outward from the hearth foundation. This is the way the Scandinavians built them, he continued. Angled throat, wide base, narrow top, draft poles, upward even in storm. The valley keeps copying the English style, tall and straight. But the English don't have these winds or these temperatures. Wind gusted across the ridge, driving his point home. That storm, Rook said quietly, wasn't your enemy. It only revealed what your cabin was hiding. The boy studied every line in the snow diagram. So, if we fix all this, the next storm won't kill us? Rook placed a calloused hand on his shoulder. No chimney lasts forever, but a good one gives you a fair fight. The father crouched beside them, his face heavy with regret. I didn't know, he whispered. I thought I built it right. No one taught you, Rook replied. And this land punishes guesswork. He stood and brushed snow from his hands. But you're about to learn. What followed was a lesson in frontier engineering, the kind never written in books, passed instead from one cold valley to another. Rook drew diagrams in the snow. The optimal throat width, 14 to 16 inches. The best flue angle, a 512-degree outward lean. The thickness of stone needed to insulate creosote heat. The right way to mix lime mortar so it cured even in near-freezing weather. He showed the boy how clay liner sleeves prevented tar buildup, how riverstone must be sorted, smooth stones near the interior for heat reflectivity, jagged stones outward for structural bite, how chimney caps could break downdrafts by splitting wind. The boy repeated everything back to him, stumbling at first, then steady. Rook corrected him gently. As clouds thickened for another storm, the father asked, "Will we have time to build it before the weather turns?" Rook glanced at the horizon, then at the ruined cabin, then at the boy, the one who had breathed smoke and survived. "We have time," he said, "if the three of us work like one." He turned to the boy. "Tomorrow, you'll start laying the first stones." But could a half-frozen family and one carpenter rebuild a safe chimney before the next winter blow arrived? The next morning broke with a sharp clarity that only high country winters can offer. The sky was an endless silver sheet, and the air held the metallic smell of snow waiting to fall. Jonas Rook was already awake, sorting stones by shape and weight. The father and boy joined him, each carrying the quiet seriousness of people who had seen death up close. Rook began with foundation work. "A chimney is only as strong as what it stands on," he said, tapping the frozen earth. "Your old one sat on a shallow base. Frost moved it every year. That's why the mortar cracked." He handed the boy a small spade. "Dig me 12 inches deep all the way around. We're giving this one roots." The ground was hard as bone. Every inch the boy dug sent vibrations up his arms, but he worked without complaint. Rook watched with a craftsman's patience. When the foundation pit was ready, they laid the first course of stones, riverstone for the inner ring, jagged granite for the outer. The father mixed lime mortar with warm water kept in a clay pot inside the coat of his vest, preventing freezing as they worked. Rook pressed a stone into place, checked its line, then stepped back. "Good. Now we rise." For hours, the three shaped the chimney base. Rook guided their hands with a teacher's rhythm. The boy learned to smear mortar with the flat of his palm. The father learned to judge stone weight by the dull thud it made when dropped. But the real lesson came when Rook angled the throat. He lifted a flat riverstone and held it out. "This one decides whether you live through next winter." He placed it not straight but slanted, just a few degrees outward. "So this angle," he said, tapping it, "lets the wind help you instead of hurt you. The valley wind pushes across the top of the chimney. If the throat leans right, the pressure difference pulls smoke upward." He pointed toward the distant ridge. "That wind killed your old chimney. Now it'll save your new one." By midday, the chimney rose knee-high. The storm clouds darkened. A cold, heavy stillness settled over the hollow, a warning that time was short. Rook quickened the pace. They added a clay liner sleeve, a cylinder shaped from wet river clay and baked in the remnants of the old cabin's coals. This sleeve reduced direct creosote contact and insulated the throat against temperature shock. That sleeve, Rook told the boy, is the difference between a fire you control and a fire that controls you. The wind sharpened, snow began to fall in hard, dry flakes. They worked faster. By late afternoon, the chimney stood chest high. The father's breath came ragged. The boy's hands shook with fatigue. Rook alone seemed carved from the cold, moving with the steady determination of a man who had rebuilt more than chimneys in his life. At last, they reached the critical stage, curing the mortar, but the air temperature had dropped to 22 Celsius, too cold for standard curing. If the mortar froze tonight, the chimney would crack before morning. The father looked panicked. What do we do? Rook pointed to the fire they had kept burning outside. We heat the stones, not the air. They used shovels to carry glowing embers and place them carefully inside the chimney's base. The heat radiated upward, warming the stones without scorching the wet mortar, a method used by Scandinavian carpenters, almost unknown in the American West. The boy crouched beside the stones, mesmerized. It's like the fire is helping us build, Rook nodded. In a way, yes. They continued until dusk. The chimney, warmed from within, stood firm against the frost. But as evening fell, a violent wind began rattling the branches above. The storm had arrived early. Rook's jaw tightened. We're out of time. The storm will hit before midnight. The father looked toward the half-completed cabin frame. Will the chimney hold? Rook placed a hand on the stones, feeling them as if checking the pulse of a living creature. It'll hold, if we finish the cap now. They scrambled to the roofline, lashing stones together, with fast-setting mortar working by lantern light as snow fell harder and the wind roared across the ridge. The boy carried stones up the ladder. Rook shaped the capstone with the blunt edge of his axe, sparks hissing in the cold. Finally, with a grunt, he set the capstone into place. Rook exhaled. It's done. But the storm, furious and insistent, was not done with them. And as the wind screamed across the ridge, the new chimney faced its first true enemy, the night. Night came down like a lid over the mountains. The ridge vanished beneath a wall of snow as the storm gathered its strength and hurled itself at the unfinished cabin. Jonas Rook stood outside for a long moment after setting the chimney cap, testing the air with a craftsman's instinct. Snowflakes struck his face sideways. The wind howled along the valley floor and curled upward in violent spirals. It's a bad one, he murmured. A real tester. Inside the half-restored cabin, the father and boy had already lit the fire in the new hearth. The flames glowed inside the clay-lined throat, rising smooth and steady. For the first time in days, smoke lifted straight up, not swirling back into their faces. The draft was clean, almost elegant. But storms change everything. A sudden gust shook the cabin. Snow blew through cracks in the unfinished walls. The lantern flame guttered. Outside, the storm roared in a voice that seemed alive. A deep, resonant moan that caught between the trees and flung itself across the chimney cap. Rook closed the door behind him and leaned into the room, listening. Listen long enough to storms, he believed, and you could hear their language. Anger, cold, warning. The father looked up, nervous. Will the chimney hold? Rook didn't answer immediately, which frightened them more than an outright yes or no. Storms test everything, he finally said. But this one is built to fight back. Another gust struck. This time the wind found the roofline, forcing air downward along the chimney's exterior. In the old design, this pressure would have shoved smoke backward through the flue and filled the cabin with choking soot. But the new chimney leaned just slightly toward the storm's force. Instead of ramming smoke down, the wind skated past the throat, creating a suction that pulled the fire upward. A perfect draft. For a moment, then the storm found its strength. The wind screamed at scraping across the chimney cap hard enough to make the clay sleeve inside vibrate. The fire pulsed in response, shrinking, then flaring, with a sudden, dangerous hunger. Heat surged in the throat. The boy stepped back as the firebox snapped, sending sparks inward. It's pulling too hard, the father cried. Rook strode forward, adjusting the vent plate on the iron grate. Strong winds build strong drafts, he said. But strong drafts can starve a fire or overfeed it. Balance matters. The wind struck again, a monstrous fist of air. The stove hissed like a creature waking. Flames leapt higher, brushing the clay liner, casting wild shapes against the walls. Rook put a hand to the stones, feeling the temperature. Hot, he muttered, but holding. Outside, snow piled against the cabin walls, forcing the door inward. The storm wanted to bury them under its weight. Inside, smoke patterns began shifting from smooth columns to violent spirals. The boy watched with wide eyes. Is it going to break? Rook knelt beside him. Every chimney faces a night like this. The question isn't whether it breaks, he pointed at the flue, but whether the people who built it understood what they were doing. The father swallowed hard. And did we? The wind answered for him, slamming into the roof with a sound like cannon fire. For a moment, the draft twisted. A single tongue of smoke curled downward and brushed the stone hearth. The boy gasped. That's what it did before! But this time the chimney held its ground. Rook tightened the vent again, reducing the fire's pull. The clay sleeve glowed faintly as the heat redistributed evenly, preventing the rapid temperature spike that had destroyed the old chimney. Slowly, steadily, the draft stabilized. Minutes felt like hours. Each gust shook the walls, rattled the stones, tested the seams. The father hovered near the far wall, terrified to see it glow red again. But the glow did not return. The chimney, warmed earlier by internal embers, suffered no shock cracks. The angled throat cut the wind's attack. The clay liner absorbed the temperature swings. The capstone split the downdraft. Piece by piece, the design proved itself. Finally, after what felt like an entire night compressed into 20 minutes, the boy whispered the truth. Neither of them had dared to hope. It's working. Rook let out a breath and leaned back against the wall. It's doing exactly what it was built to do. The storm raged on. Snow rose halfway up the cabin. The wind tried every trick it knew, spiraling, stalling, pushing, dragging. But the chimney held fast, refusing to collapse, refusing to choke them. Inside, for the first time during a storm, the cabin was warm. Not uneven heat, not smoke-choked comfort, steady, even warmth. The father sank to the floor, exhausted. The boy stood near the hearth, staring into the glowing fire, as if trying to memorize the moment. Rook smiled at him. You built this, he said. You and your father. Remember every stone. Remember every angle. When you build your next cabin, and you'll know how to keep your family alive. The boy nodded slowly. Outside, the storm's rage began to fade. Inside, embers glowed like coals, resting beneath a black eyelid. The trial had come and passed. But once a design survives its first storm, the frontier begins to notice. The storm died sometime before dawn, leaving behind a valley remade in silence. Snow lay in great sculpted waves along the ground. Pines bowed beneath heavy ice. The world was muted, softened, held in a breathless pause as if waiting to see who had survived the night. In the half-finished cabin, embers still glowed with a steady heartbeat. The chimney stood firm, pale steam curling softly upward from its capstone. Jonas Rook opened the door and stepped outside, squinting against the white glare of morning. He pressed a hand to the chimney's outer stones. Warm, solid, uncracked. It had survived. The father joined him, his breath rising in white clouds. Jonas, I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to, Rook replied. Just remember what you learned, and teach it forward. The boy emerged next, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He stared at the chimney as if it were something alive, a creature that had stood between them and death. What do we do now? The boy asked. Rook smiled. Now? Now we tell others. He wasn't exaggerating. Word traveled fast in a frontier valley. Faster than horses, faster than mail packets. Before noon, 2 trappers emerged from the trees, their faces chapped by wind. They had seen the glow of the chimney's smoke plume the night before, and assumed the cabin had burned entirely. When they found it standing, whole, warm, smoke rising clean and straight, Their expressions shifted from confusion to awe. "You rebuilt it?" one asked. "Last night's storm was worse than the one that burned your first chimney." Rook nodded. "And it held." The second trapper, a broad-shouldered man with frozen whiskers, stepped close to the stones. "You angled the throat," he said slowly, tracing the lines with his eyes. "Never seen that before." "That's because most of us build chimneys the way our fathers did," Rook answered, "even when the land tells us it's wrong." By evening, 4 more men arrived, then another 2 the following morning. Some came out of curiosity. Others came with fear in their eyes. Memories of smoke-choked nights, of embers leaping from the hearth, of cabins lost to sudden collapses. One man, older and bent from years of trapping, approached the chimney and touched it with trembling fingers. "My brother died in a creosote fire," he whispered. "Didn't stand a chance." He looked up at Rook. "Teach me." And so Rook did. Each day the circle around the chimney widened. Rook explained the flue angle again and again, drawing it in snow and ash and mud. He showed them how to harvest clay for liners, how to mix lime mortar with warm water, how to sort riverstones for proper insulation. The boy watched it all with hungry eyes, repeating each step until it lived inside him. By the 4th day, the little clearing had become an impromptu classroom. Men gathered with notebooks made of scrap parchment, charcoal sticks gripped in cold hands. Frontier wisdom rarely looked like schooling, but the hunger to survive can turn any space into a classroom. Rook never raised his voice, never hurried, never called himself a teacher. He simply shared the knowledge that had saved one family, and would soon save many more. The father rebuilt the cabin walls with the help of neighbors, using stones now sorted properly and logs cut with better alignment. As the walls rose, so did the understanding of every man present. By the end of the week, a clear truth had spread across the valley. The old way wouldn't do anymore. Shallow bases, straight throats, cold mortar, no insulation, no vent control. All of it needed to change. Rook didn't have to convince anyone. The storm had already done the convincing. On the 6th morning, a trapper from the far ridge approached the cabin, his horse steaming in the icy air. "I heard you built a chimney that stands in the west wind," he said. "I need one. My family needs one." Rook studied him for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the boy. "He'll show you." The trapper blinked in surprise. The father smiled with quiet pride. The boy's chest rose with a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Rook knelt beside the boy. "It's your turn," he said softly. "This knowledge will die with me, if you don't carry it forward." The boy tightened his grip on the tool handle. "I will." Rook stood and clapped him on the shoulder. "Then let's go build something that will outlive us both." But how far would this new chimney wisdom travel, and how many lives would it change before winter ended? Years passed. Winters came and went. Storms rose and broke. But the valley remembered the night the chimney stood against the storm of 34. Frontier stories don't often live in parchment or ink. They live in memory, passed from mouth to mouth like warm coals carried from one hearth to another. And Jonas Rook's chimney became one of them. By 1837, a visitor riding into the valley would have seen an unfamiliar sight, a patchwork of cabins whose chimneys leaned ever so slightly westward, each one lined with river clay, each one capped with split stone crowns shaped by hand. The design spread not because it was taught formally, but because it kept families alive. Every cabin withstood the storms better. Smoke lifted cleaner. Fires burned hotter, safer, with less creosote buildup. Chimney collapses, once common as frostbite, became rare. And always, in every story told around every fire, there was mention of a boy who had breathed smoke and lived. By the time that boy reached adulthood, he had built 7 chimneys with his own hands, each one better than the last, each one carrying the lessons Rook had taught him, not as rules, but as truths carved into practice. Neighbors sought him out when they planned to build new cabins. Trappers brought him to distant ridges to fix flues. Families paid in whatever they had: pelts, coffee, flour, a single warm blanket. He never asked for more. Every time he lifted a stone into place, he heard Rook's voice in his memory. Strong isn't the same as right. And with every chimney he built, he made something right again. In 1841, when a traveling surveyor passed through the region, he noted something unusual in his journal. The chimneys of this valley are unlike those I have seen elsewhere. They lean with the wind. The people claim this small angle has saved many lives. One boy, now a grown man, is credited with spreading the method. The surveyor never learned the full story, how the boy had knelt in snow beside a stranger named Jonas Rook, or how a storm had shown a family the price of ignorance. But history rarely remembers the details. It remembers the pattern, and the pattern of safe chimneys had begun here. In the harsh winter of 1843, when the valley faced another violent storm, something extraordinary happened. Not a single chimney failed. Cabins rattled, roofs groaned, snow climbed window ledges, but every hearth burned with steady breath, upward, clean, safe. The boy, now a father himself, stood outside in the storm's lull and watched smoke rise from a dozen chimneys at once. Each plume cut a warm mark against the gray sky. He felt a tightness in his throat, a mixture of pride and memory. For a moment, he saw not the valley before him, but the ruined cabin of his childhood. The night smoke swallowed their breaths, the stranger who rebuilt their world from the foundation up. When the storm ended, the boy, now a man, taught his own son how to shape stone, how to lay mortar in cold, how to angle a throat to outsmart the wind. Knowledge had become legacy, and legacy had become survival. In the decades that followed, the method spread quietly beyond the valley. Traders learned it, then missionaries, then homesteaders carving new claims along the Wind River. It appeared in sketches on fur company manifests, in notes sent home by settlers, even in the construction of small outposts that later historians would call remarkably resilient for their time. But in the cabin where it began, the original chimney of 34 still stood, blackened in places, worn smooth in others, but firm, loyal, and unchanged. The sun, now gray at the temples, often rested his hand upon its stones. He would whisper a quiet thanks to Jonas Rook, though the carpenter had vanished into the currents of frontier life long ago. No one knew where Rook ended up. Some said he followed the American Fur Company into the Northern Territories. Others claimed he settled with a family near the Snake River. A few believed, half in jest, half in reverence, that he was claimed by the wilderness itself, another spirit of wind and timber. What mattered wasn't where he went. What mattered was what he left behind. A chimney that could outlive storms, a lesson that could outlive men, a craft that could outlive memory. If stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity speak to you, there's a place for you here by the fire. Subscribe to Frontier Tales of America for more history carried on the wind. A good chimney, like a good lesson, is built to endure long after the first storm passes.